Well, welcome back to the Oasis podcast, and we're here tonight to talk about resolving conflict. My name is John Mark, and I'm here with Burnell Beachy, and we are going to continue on. I've been talking the last number of weeks with Pastor Wayne Weaver about resolving conflict, and we talked about conflicts in the home, we talked about conflicts in business, and tonight we're going to tackle the big one, conflicts in church and resolving those conflicts. But as we get started, I just want to welcome you all to this podcast. Thanks for joining us. And if you have comments or questions, you can email those to library@oasistabernacle.org and let us know what you think. And if you have any questions, that would be great. But Burnell, we're going to just jump right into this, and I'm glad you joined me tonight. Pastor Wayne is actually in Israel, so he's not with us, but glad to have you on tonight. And of course, you get to converse with me on this nice topic of resolving church conflicts. We've been involved in conflicts, all of us, throughout life in one way or another. And if you've been a Christian for any length of time and have gone to a church, most likely you've seen conflict in the church. And it's kind of funny because we often act surprised when conflicts happen in church. I'm not sure why, because they happen so frequently. People of God are still human, and if we read Scripture, we discover that the flesh needs to be rebuked quite a bit, and usually we want to rebuke somebody else's flesh, not our own. But how do we resolve conflicts in the church? And I think it's kind of funny. I think our first question here tonight, Burnell, is when conflicts arise in the church, we often act shocked. Why is that?
Well, yeah, we do, and yet we don't. I think we often, at least for myself, I would think, church is supposed to be a safe place. We go through lots of conflict in the business world and the world around us. And so we kind of have this expectation that at church there shouldn't be any kinds of conflicts. I mean, these are our brothers and sisters in Christ. And therefore we're kind of expecting not to have any conflicts. Yet we both know that's simply not the way it is.
All right, Christians can be so irritating at times, right?
They can be, yeah.
Yeah, imagine that. I mean, now you and I get along well, and but it's interesting how many times those conflicts do happen, and often between leaders. And that's a frustrating thing, and actually a little disconcerting for church members. And so many times people will try to weigh in on that, and in trying to resolve a conflict, I've often seen where they start taking sides. How do we resolve that issue as people try to take sides in a conflict? They want to help, so they sort of pile on to one camp or another. Is that helpful or hurtful? Or?
Well, certainly not. And maybe just to back up a bit, I mean, I grew up in a church where we had church conflict all of my growing up years. And I remember my parents driving home from church talking about this as a little child. It's all I really knew until I was about 17 or 18 years old, when my family finally, they went to another church. And so it was kind of a part of my life growing up as a child, but yeah, especially whenever there's a fracture or something in leadership, it tends to cause a chasm in the church. And if there's a division between leaders, it gives people the option to side with one side or another. And I just think it's so important. You're going to have conflict sometimes within leadership, but also sometimes within church members. And regardless of where the conflict is, sometimes if it's not between leaders, but it's between church members, even if you step in, you can all of a sudden become a part of something that you really didn't sign up for. And all of a sudden, things insults, and you become part of something that you were never originally a part of. And it's easy to want to just avoid those things, and yet they do need to be dealt with within the body. But I think one of the most important things, and one of the things that I so appreciate about our ministry team here, is we just really have a good group of leaders that I just don't sense any kind of competition between anyone here, and that's such a blessing to be a part of. And so whenever the leadership can be on the same page, it's much easier to deal with conflict that arises within church members, or wherever that may be. It's much easier to deal with if the leadership is on the same page.
Right. Right. And you mentioned something there kind of interesting, competition. And you wouldn't think that there would be a lot of that, but it does seem like our pride gets in the way in church relations as well.
Right.
Now, there's an interesting proverb that I have always found very fascinating. It's Proverbs 26:17 that says, "Getting involved in an argument that is none of your business is like going down the street and grabbing a dog by the ears." Now, I've never actually tried going down the street and grabbing a dog by the ears, but I have waded into conflicts that weren't necessarily my own. And if getting bit is what happens when you grab a dog by the ears, that's kind of what happens when you wade into a conflict that really doesn't involve you. But when we have conflicts in church, I found that often I hear people talking, and they make these, I guess I would call them shame comments. They're sort of like, they're stating something very obvious, but they're almost trying to shame people into stopping the conflict. What are some of those shame comments that you've heard? Like I've heard the one that just is very common. Well, this shouldn't happen in the church. I mean, this is just terrible. The people of God should be getting along. Well, right. But conflict does happen in the church. Are these kinds of statements helpful in resolving conflict, or what's your opinion on that?
Well, probably not. I mean, we do tend to react more if it's in the amongst the brethren, or amongst each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. We tend to perhaps react a bit more because we're not expecting it. We're expecting it more out in the world and people we rub shoulders with in business and so forth. And I've heard some of those comments come up in maybe a members meeting, or a meeting that was set aside for to try to resolve some kind of a conflict. And things like, we should know better, we're adults, we need to grow up, and which some of that might be true.
It probably is.
We probably should grow up. And but none of them really necessarily help resolve the conflict. It's just often something that comes out as perhaps maybe a way of frustration, or just maybe just in exasperation of we just can't believe this is happening. And,
but now you mentioned too that you kind of always remembered hearing about conflict. So seeing it later on, you kind of expected it in church, but you've been a church leader, not only here at Oasis but elsewhere, and so you've seen your share of conflicts. I've seen conflicts that started in families who were kind of squabbling over an inheritance, and I've seen those conflicts that actually ripple over into multiple churches sometimes that involve multiple church leadership. So it's not always even just the leaders themselves that get involved, but sometimes we get drug into the messes within families and all of that. And I think to an extent that's a good thing, because as people in the church, we should reach into those situations. But they can also be just a little bit frustrating in how quickly they rob the peace and joy from the church.
Well, the other thing that I've often seen as well, if you're dealing with a family conflict or maybe even a marriage conflict, and you might be dealing with the one partner, not at the same time, they're not there together. And so you might make a recommendation or a suggestion, and then that partner will go home and see, Burnell told me this, and then they take that and go to some extreme, especially when it was financial issues where somebody decided, well, Burnell said this, so I can buy this. Well, now this upsets maybe the wife, and so she decides, well, I have to one-up him, and I'm going to go buy this. And so it escalates. And so sometimes it's very dicey how you enter into some of those things, because you might even have to, I recently had to advise someone about something, but I said, now just please leave my name out of it. And so, because you never know when your name is going to come up in a meeting somewhere else, someone will say, well, Burnell said, and now my name is attached to that. And so now I might have a whole host of other people that are very upset with me because of the way that I would have advised someone.
Not realizing all of the
you don't always
particulars
know
that
the
went into it
dynamics
in the context of when that was spoken. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as a church leader, looking back over the conflicts that you've experienced in church, what are some of the things that you wish people would keep in mind when going through a conflict?
I would say a lot of, we discuss a lot of things that perhaps lay members don't always hear. There's a lot of discussion that goes on, decisions that, there's meetings that we're a part of that no one else sees. And so sometimes, when you're arriving at a conclusion for a certain issue or something, some people might not fully understand why you arrived at that. And I wish, and I try to be careful myself. Sometimes even our government officials make decisions that I don't understand. Why are they making this kind of a decision? Well, I know that there's probably other things about their decision that I don't know about. There's meetings and conversations and things that go on that I was not a part of, and so I don't know for sure what went into that decision. And so the other thing is just go directly. If you have a question, go directly to the source. Go to the person that, whatever it is you may have an issue with or you heard. A lot of people will base things on, well, I heard, or people are saying. And I had a pastor once that told me that a member had brought up an issue, and then he used the phrase the whole time, well, people are saying. It sounded like, half the church was talking about this. Well, it turned out when they really narrowed it down, two people got their heads together in the parking lot. And it turned out that people were saying. It was only two people. And so sometimes I think, people need to be careful how the terminology they use. It can sound like it's a massive uproar, and it's maybe just two people. And it's easy to then view perhaps the whole church through one or two eyes. And you start to assume, well, everyone must feel this way, or everyone's like this. And really, it's about one or two people. Mm-hmm. And so I think people need to be careful the terminology, and don't just go off of, well, I heard someone say. Go directly to that person and just ask the question, instead of going around and finding other people to team up with and then forming teams within a team. Mm-hmm. And soon you have a whole bunch of people upset over something that they never were really initially upset over. So
wow,
that
that's
would be
good. Yeah.
A few things, yeah.
I remember at times one conflict that had happened, and it was among leaders, and I remember an individual from the church coming and telling me, well, I talked to this one and they say this, and I talked to this one and they say that. One of them's lying. and I said, well, maybe not. The problem is perspectives can vary as well, and that's one of the things that I wish people could remember in a conflict is how a certain situation goes down can often vary, and how people interpret that it can vary. I remember ministering with people at times, on a weekend revival or a week of revival, and coming away, and I thought it was a modest response, only to hear from others who had been there that this was just the next thing to the Great Awakening, and I would sit there and think, man, were we at the same place? Yeah. But perspectives do vary.
They do.
And what happens is often, I think, spoken from an honest heart, but many times a perspective on how this went down can change. So I think we have to give people the benefit of the doubt and realize that even though it doesn't look like that to us, there are often different ways of interpreting what has happened.
And people hear, you can have a table, 5 people, and you can have a meeting, and you can walk away and 5 people heard 5 different things. I've been in meetings where after the meeting, a frantic person would call me and say, well, I heard so-and-so say this, and we need to do this. And he was, very adamant and urgent. And I remember thinking, well, that's so not what I heard him say. And, so you had to have another meeting to address that, only to find out, none of the others heard what he heard. And so I always try to, make sure, did I hear sometimes even just a tone of voice, depending what kind of a tone of voice you use, will say something to one person that it doesn't to another. And so I think people need to be aware that perhaps I heard differently, and I want to make sure, is this what I for sure heard? And perspectives and personalities and all of that plays into how we hear things. And so that can really sometimes cause some unnecessary conflict, is just because, well, I might have heard wrong, so let's make sure that perhaps I need to compare with some others. Is this what you heard? And not just base it on what I think I heard.
But then in comparing with others, it's a good thing. That can also lead into some gossip at times. And did you hear what I heard?
Yeah.
Well, I'm pretty sure what I heard was right? What are some things that people typically do in conflict? It just seems like you look at a conflict and you're like, okay, I'm sure this is going to happen. What are some things that people do that typically make conflicts worse rather than better? They're trying to help.
Yeah.
But
well, I wish we could. Well, typically what we do, or what I've found out, is we go everywhere except to the source or the person we should be going to. And I don't know why. Is it? I've really looked at this. Is it our culture? Is it our background? Is it the way we do things? Because in the Middle East, the way they handle conflicts is very different than the way we do. And it's far more confrontational. It's much more in your face. It's upfront. There's nothing hidden. And I've watched this in the Middle East, like in Israel, where, now this was in Hebrew, so I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could see 2 vendors on opposite ends of the street really got in a heated exchange. I mean, it was pretty dramatic, and I wasn't sure whether there's going to be a fight that's going to break out. And then all of a sudden, in the midst of that, the one just shrugged his shoulders and kind of went like this, and the other one laughed, and it was all over. And whatever issue they had, they just went right at it. They just went, there was nothing hidden. And it seemed like they very quickly resolved it, even though there were some emotions involved. And yet, for some reason, at least my background, we don't tend to do that. But yet we get very emotional, but we do it kind of behind in a much more subtle way. And we go to other people, and before long we form teams and we form groups, and now we have other people involved that were never initially involved in the original conflict. And so That's what I've typically seen being done.
And that seems to be the natural progression. It doesn't take long before those things begin to happen.
Then it's he said, she said, and finally, 5 years later, you don't really even know what the original conflict was. It's because it just escalates into one thing and goes from one thing to another. And I think sometimes if we would just initially get it out and get it up front in your face and get it out there, I wonder sometimes if we couldn't overcome some conflicts maybe a little quicker that way versus having them hidden away.
Well, what usually happens is they hide away, and we sort of edge around them and just sort of try to edge into the conflict a little bit and try to influence until we get so fed up, and then we have that face-to-face thing that is actually damaging.
Right.
We don't necessarily get right into it, and oftentimes we try to hide our motives. That sounds like we're painting with a pretty broad brush, but I think it does happen that way. Another thing that I've seen is people that will come up and they will say, well, man, I'll just tell you, if I was in charge, I'd get this thing over with real quick, you know, we'll just crack some heads together. And well, how helpful is that?
Yeah, probably not very helpful, although that would be a simple, I wish that would work, because that would be a very simple way of dealing with things, but oftentimes you don't know the full dynamics of what's really going on. And I've even seen, you know, outside committees come in and try to help, and sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, because they don't really know for sure what's going on. They haven't been there. They don't know the group and what's really been involved or what's been going on.
And there's kind of an expectation, too. If you bring them in for a weekend, they're supposed to solve in a weekend what it's taken the congregation, you know, months to unravel. So they often come in and try to see, well, which group seems to be the most powerful here. Let's find a resolution, because we can sort of smooth things over a little bit. Well, what are some simple things that the average church member can do to help move a conflict to a resolution, to reconciliation? And I'm going to, as you're thinking about that, I want to just read two verses out of Proverbs. Proverbs 26:20 says, "Without wood a fire goes out, and without gossip a quarrel dies down." Well, you know about building a fire. If you don't put more wood on it, it's going to die down. It takes a bit of wood to build it back up. Proverbs 16:28 also says, "A devious person spreads quarrels. A gossip separates the closest of friends." I think gossip is one of the things that, if we could stop that in a conflict, it would really help to resolve and move a conflict through toward a resolution. What's the difference between gossip and sharing prayer requests and insights to concerned members? How do you determine that?
You mean between...
what's the difference between gossip and, you know, you often hear people, well, I'm just sharing this for prayer.
Okay.
You know, I knew they had some of the same concerns that I did, but coming out of that, it's more like a war room. How do we keep from concerns actually being concerns and not becoming malicious? Or
Well, yeah, it's like you said, I think gossip is one of the most damaging things that you can do within a body, because you're really not doing anything to really solve the problem unless you're going directly to the person that it involves with. And that's why I think things can escalate to a point where several years down the road, no one really knows what the original conflict was even about. I know in my growing up years, if you would ask me, well, what was the problem? I don't know, and I don't think anyone else really even knew. It wasn't even several years ago, I was talking to a pastor, and they were having some conflict in their church, and he said, you know, I could ask 20 people what they think the problem is, and I'd get 20 different answers. And I think that's because there was so much gossip and he said and she said that it's finally so far removed from the original conflict that nobody really for sure knows what we're even fighting over. We're in a war, but we're not quite sure what it's all about. And the other thing too, offended people, Jesus said in the last days many will be offended. Offended, hurt people, insecure people, I think can be because insecure people need validation. They want to be validated. They want to be recognized. They want to be revered, perhaps. And so they'll go around looking for that and sometimes don't realize the damage that they're doing by trying to get some of that affirmation that an insecure person so desperately craves for. And
nobody ever wants to admit in a conflict that you're insecure, right?
Right.
Yeah.
No. Probably would be the wrong thing to say at the time.
Well, they wouldn't want to identify that, eh?
And sometimes I think, I don't know, I've had cases where it took me a while to realize, but it was they're after the position, not necessarily the person. I had a man once that I just said, well, would you like to be the pastor? Because if you want to be the pastor, I'm fine. I don't really need this position, but if you'd like it, you're more than welcome to have it. And now he admitted he wouldn't admit that that's what he wanted, but it was very clear he was very upset with the ordination. And so sometimes it's someone has a real, perhaps a craving for a position, or they want a certain recognition for something, and they're often, those can really cause a lot of, because they go around to other people.
Right.
And before long, their offense becomes someone else's offense. And very quickly you can form teams that are very, very toxic and create a very toxic environment. And so, that would be one thing that offended people can cause just a tremendous amount of, you can spend years building something up to have one offended person come and tear down what you've spent years building up. And so those can be some very, very damaging situations.
It seems like with those offenses and with those typical behaviors that come with that, the bitterness, I have found that sometimes, especially in leadership positions, that people who were very, very opposed were quite often, they had an issue with leadership in general.
Right.
If you're out in the community, you would have an issue with the policeman, or you would have an issue with others. And it can seem simplistic at times. You can say, well, that is just the way they are. But dealing with people who have a rebellious spirit, that can look so righteous at times. And I've found that many times in an issue with leadership, people will often try to find a sanctified way of being rebellious. The doctrine is wrong. The way they handle things are wrong. The way this or that or the other is wrong. Dealing with that can be a real challenge. And as you think back in leadership, what are some things that as a leader you wish you would have known before you became sort of embroiled in that first big church conflict that you were sort of responsible for? What are some things that would have been helpful had you known that?
Well, if I could talk to myself as a young pastor, I remember years ago where I worked at, a pastor walked in and he gave me one word of advice, and he said, whatever you do, just don't take anything personal. Now, I didn't for sure know what he meant at that time. I just remember I thought, well, people would surely just adore me and love me because I'm their pastor.
Burnell, yeah, that's great.
And I'm here for you, and I am at the hospital when you're there, and I study to preach for you on Sundays, and all these kinds of things. I just thought people would surely would just really like me.
Because you always liked your pastors, right?
Actually, yeah, for the most part, I was not I was kind of shocked when I was ordained, because up until I was ordained, I don't know that I don't think I ever called my pastor for anything. Maybe I didn't know that I had more access perhaps than what I knew, but I just never really called him for anything. I just kind of figured life out. And so I was kind of surprised, when I'd get phone calls about things that I thought, well, surely you could figure that out. But I realized quickly that, well, people look to you and they're expecting a response or an answer. And so I just thought, well, since I'm doing all this, surely they would just adore me. And well, if now looking back, I would say to a young pastor is, listen, not everyone will always like you. They will not always like every message you preach. They will not always think that what you did was the right thing to do. And you just do the best you can. And whatever decision they decide to come up with and run with, then that's up to them. I used to agonize over a marriage that couldn't get resolved. And I took it so personal because, why would someone in my congregation have so many problems? Evidently, I'm not a good pastor. Well, no, I realize that happens to everyone. And you do the best you can, and whatever decision they choose to make, that's the result that they'll have. And so I learned to not take so much and put so much weight on myself, because at the end of the day, people still choose and they still decide their own fate. Essentially, we try to advise and we speak into people's lives, but at the end, they choose to do whatever they want with that. And so I learned to not take it as personal if it's not the way that I would have chosen. So,
and that's very good advice, because I remember it wasn't long into my calling as a pastor that I ended up being involved in a conflict that was it was so much bigger than I was able to. I mean, I couldn't just be Mr. Nice Guy and find a way to gentle my way out of that or through it. And I remember at one point feeling like, God, I must be out of your will, because this conflict can't bring you any glory. So me being in this position is really causing, I must be terrible at this. And, I probably wasn't all that good at it, but I don't know that I was as terrible as I was thinking I was at the time. And I think that's great advice. Don't take it too personal. If you would have known, go ahead.
You want to see people succeed. You want to see people thrive, and that's the ultimate that you want to see. But I had to realize that not everything is going to be ideal. It's not going to be perfect. When you're shepherding a flock of sheep, it's not always going to be exactly the way that you think, and you really just have to be okay with sometimes the way things are, and just accept that I've done the best I can, and the results are up to the Lord. He'll do a work in their life.
So what would you tell a church member today, very concerned, very sorrowful about the conflict that is happening in their congregation? What would you tell them today as a word of comfort?
You're talking another pastor, or like another?
I'm talking about a church. Somebody in a church. They're going there. There's a conflict, maybe with leadership. There's a conflict, maybe with congregation toward leadership. What is something that you would encourage them with?
Well, I would probably say, do everything that you can to be part of the solution. Don't add to the problem that's already there. And, I don't know how far, how long do you stay somewhere and try to resolve something until you realize that, this is not going to be resolved and you need to move on. I don't know where that line is. I know it's somewhere there, but I would in my case, I did everything. I stayed there as long as I could, and felt that I need to try to help bring resolution instead of stomping out mad and getting upset and causing a ruckus. So I guess my advice would be, do everything that you can, and especially don't gossip. If there is a problem with a certain person, go directly to them and resolve it with them instead of going around and trying to form other teams. And that has never helped. I have never seen where that has ever solved a conflict.
Right.
It just doesn't. And be a solution, not add to the problem.
That's good. And I think I would add to that, when going directly to a person or a group, don't rely on third-party accusations. When somebody comes up and says, I know this, but don't tell them.
Right.
Don't tell them I said this, but would you address this? One of the things that I started doing is when accusations would come to me against somebody else, I would say, you know what, have you gone to them? And they would say, well, no, I just don't feel comfortable. I'd say, well, you know what, I'll go with you to talk to them. But if I take your accusation to them, that won't help to resolve it. But if you have that, I'll go with you. And so maybe that's something that somebody out there listening tonight, you'd say, don't take the third-party accusations. If it comes, be willing to be a part of the solution and say, you know what, I'll go with you, and we can talk about this. Not to hammer on somebody, but to find a resolution for that. Ephesians 4, is it verse 32, tells us to be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. And really, church conflicts will probably continue on as long as we live. But God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. He's given us a word of reconciliation. And there are so many principles about making peace that are found in His word. And you and I will probably find ourselves embroiled in another conflict at some point in some way. We're not supposed to be surprised by the fiery trials that come against us as if they were strange.
And sometimes the more you try to avoid a conflict, the more conflict you create.
Right.
Sometimes people are so desperately try to avoid it, they actually run right into it. And sometimes you just need to meet things head on and just deal with them in the most kind and rational way that you can. And but if you sweep things under the rug, eventually the rug is going to smell, and the stuff that's underneath there gets much more difficult to deal with later than if you just deal with them now.
Right.
So
good words. So thank you, Burnell, for joining me tonight on this podcast.
My pleasure.
Obviously, we just scratched the surface of resolving church conflict, but I want to just end with a real a word from Psalms that is a good prayer in times of conflict, and I would encourage you to use this. It just says this, Psalm 19:14, "Let the word of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer." Thanks for joining us tonight. God bless you, and look forward to chatting with you next week. Have a good evening.